Good morning.
Good morning.
So, when we did the trip as a family years and years ago now, we went to, on the Alaskan Highway, there is a wonderful place in Fort Laird. It's a hot springs. And what's really unique about this hot spring is that it's just a river. You walk into a river. And on one end is this bubbling hot, and then the other side is a cold. And you can pick your temperature where you want to go. But if you're daring and somewhat lacking of intelligence like I was at the time, perhaps still, there is a wall that's around the bubbling hot where it's so hot. And they built a wall so you can't get any closer than that because you will get burnt. But if you walk to that hot water and you put a stone on that wall, that's kind of like what people would say is, that's your feat of greatness. So that is what I strive to do. And it took a long time. You take a few steps and you stop because it's so hot, and you get used to it, and then you take a few more steps and it's hot, and you keep realizing it's going to get hotter, but it takes a while. I use this analogy because this is what I felt like we were doing with the Sermon on the Plain in Matthew. We were just getting into it, and we're getting closer and closer, and it's harder and harder as you get into this passage that Jesus gives, and so I'm building myself up and building myself up for it. And along with this is also the passage in 1 Corinthians. And so I'm finding each week I was kind of like, okay, it's getting heavier, but take a few steps, take your time. I was thinking about this because I realized that Lent has created a problem for me. Next week is not the first Sunday in Lent. It's the Transfiguration of Jesus Sunday, or Transformation? Transfiguration. It's one of those Sundays, and then Lent. And so I looked ahead and realized that the lectionary was just going to veer off. And we were left with this kind of starting to build into this Sermon on the Plains, or Sermon on the Plains, I think it's Matthew, and Luke is Sermon on the Mount. Anyways, we were getting into it, and now we were just going to leave it. And we were going to leave it exactly at the point of where Jesus kind of challenges us and says, you're losing your salt. You aren't salt of the earth. When you no longer have that flavor, you are nothing. Or as a light, are we shining bright? And then just to make sure that we feel that tension, he says, he talks about how we have to follow every iota of the law. And then he says, he uses the scribes and the Pharisees who prided themselves on it, on fulfilling every law, and says, yeah, but they're the least. So we're like, well, then what are we supposed to do? And how do we get that saltiness? And how do we get that light back? And that, we were just going to end with that sense of us, and then go into Lent. And I like Lent, and I think Lent, no, actually, I struggle with Lent, but I think Lent is important. So, but, stop doing that. I'm sorry, I'm stuck into my computer. So I decided that I would do something this Sunday that's a little weird. And again, back to the Fort Laird, I'm basically going to do a cannonball into the very hottest place. And I'm just going to take us through what's left on the Sermon of the Plain, just so that we get...
Sermon on the Mount.
No, Sermon on the Mount is Luke. Sermon on the Plain is Matthew.
Backwards.
Really?
Yeah.
No, it says Sermon on the Plain.
It does not.
Somewhere in here I'll probably talk about accepting when you're wrong, but I'm not going to read that part. Because what we are challenged to in these next few passages is hard. And it is supposed to be hard, and it's supposed to be, even as hard as it gets, it's supposed to define who we are. More than probably anything else. There was a piety movement that went through the churches where, and there were some good aspects to it, but it became much more that your relationship with God and how you appear and how you present, and it took a lot of people, it swept them up into that, I have to be a pious person. But really, what we need to do is we need to be the people who aren't necessarily seen as holy, but the people who do the holy work. It's not how the world sees us, it's what we're doing that matters. And that is really what this starts to get down to. So let me, in a very quick fashion, whip over all of these things. Unfortunately, my Bible at home had nice little captions, and this one does not. But what it starts to tell us is that at first, after this kind of, you have to be at least like the scribes and the Pharisees in fulfilling the law, the first thing Jesus talks about is anger. It says that we can't be a people that respond out of anger. That is, it's not that there aren't good reasons for us to be angry at times. That's not the point. The point is that we can't let anger then dictate how we respond to people, because when we respond in anger, we often lose sight of what is important: the love, the grace, and the mercy. We can be angry about situations, about injustice. In fact, that is one of the things. We can be angry when people are not treated fairly. But how we respond to them means that we have to hold on to that anger and rise above it and become a people of love and grace and understanding, even when we don't want to. Because that is how we confront injustice. If we respond to anger by simply being angry to those people who are doing wrong, we're just throwing fuel onto the fire. And then it goes on to other aspects, adultery and divorce. And again, at a time when it was possible for a man to say, you know what, I want a new wife. And Jesus is like, no, if you make a covenant, you live with that covenant. And that whole sense of the importance of being people of our word, of holding to the things that we have taken on to. And then there's the oaths, vows that comes up in this. I'm moving through this quickly. But the whole vow, don't swear on the kingdom of heaven. Don't swear on anything, but let your yes be yes and your no be no. This is one of those aspects where, as Mennonites, this is crucial to how we understand our position. Because when we go into places where they say, do you swear or do you vow, like swear on the Bible or stuff, we say no, we don't. Because we can't control God. What we control is whether our yes is a yes or our no is a no. And so we affirm our statements. And then, so all at this point, okay, it's, we can't be angry, we can't swear, we have to hold to our word, we have to treat people justly, and then it starts to get interesting. So if someone comes up to you right now and strikes you on the cheek, we are called to turn the other cheek. And it's, it's a statement that, turn the other cheek. If someone's mean to you, you mean. But this, in and of itself, is something that is foundational to our relationship with this world. It means that even as the world treats us poorly, we respond with patience and grace and understanding and love. And that is not easy. But that is part of what we are called to do that marks us as different. And when it's the same passage where if someone comes and says, the Roman soldiers could approach anyone and say, you have to carry my pack for a mile. Then our statement is, well, I will carry it for 2. It's going beyond what people ask or is expected of us to be the people that make a difference. If they ask for our cloak, we give them our shirt. We go past what is expected. And then to just make sure we get the point, Jesus says, great, you love those who love you. That's what everyone does. But as followers of Christ, we are called to love those who are our enemies. Because again, this is what marks and makes us different. To be the people that are different. That society looks at and goes, those people are weird. And I confess that there have been times in my life when I have just wanted to fit in. I don't want to be the person that sticks out. Just yesterday, someone came up to me and they we were talking, and they were talking about, they were a doctor, and how, people are always coming to them for, they want quick fix. Something's wrong in their life, they want a pill that fix it. And we were talking about the struggle in that, and I was talking about, and he says, as a person of faith, and I said, yeah, we have to work at this. This takes time, and it takes dedication on our part to change. And then he says to me, so I'm just, what denomination are you? And I'm like, I was hoping he wasn't going to ask that, because as soon as I said Mennonite, he went, oh. And I'm like, okay, first off, no, I don't have a horse. And then I had to go through the whole thing, because out here, when people hear Mennonites, they think of the more visual aspect of the Mennonite church. The old order, the distinct dress, the large vans. That is where their mind goes. And so I have to say, it's not that, there isn't value or there isn't connection, but that's not who we are. And so it took me a little while, but I just prefer not to have to talk about it sometimes, because it then becomes kind of like, well, why don't you wear, I don't know, like pins and have a nice black hat? The hat would be nice. But the whole thing that Jesus is telling us is that, yeah, we will stick out. Yeah, we will be different. We will not fit in with everyone else. Because what the world and the society say we are called to be is not who Jesus is calling us to be. We are to be a light in this world. And a light in and of itself, on top of a hill, draws attention to itself. So even though I'm like, oh, it is what we are called to do. And the light that we shine is the light of grace and love, understanding, compassion, and mercy. Jesus then goes on and says, how we act in faith. The whole idea of how we give. Don't be the people that kind of, walk around with and put the money into the plates and make a big deal out of it. It's quiet and private. And I think, personally, as a congregation, like I've had some of the guys, when I've brought them in from prison, go like, how come you guys don't pass it around? I said, it's a box in the back. And I like that aspect about us, because when people come, the first impression isn't, here, give us your money. And I think that's important. It's not that we aren't called to give, it's just we're not called to give in such a way that we think somehow it gives us status or it gives us respectability. I was in Canadian Mennonite University for a brief period of time before they got rid of me. I was on the board. And they were talking about donors and major donors, and trying to find ways to set up plaques for the donors so everyone could know. And I made the statement, I said, well, isn't that kind of, not what we're supposed to do? Aren't we supposed to give quietly as opposed to give so I can get a plaque? And they all looked at me like I had two heads. Because they're like, well, no, we want to encourage people to give, and this is how we do it. And I get it. And it's not, I just think sometimes we've gotten away from some of the basics of what it was to be a church. And some of that means to be the people that we give, that our prayers aren't flashy or showy, but are sincere. The same thing with fasting, that we don't fast in a way that everyone kind of notices that we're fasting. And then he goes on with treasures. What are we going to value in this world? And of course, where he says, you can't have two masters. You follow Christ or you follow money. You can't follow both. And that's hard, because we are people who, we live in a world where we need money, but again, it's a matter of balance. What is our foundation? And again, I talked in the past, I'm saying and again a lot, whereas churches have been seen as corporations, and I hate that, because a corporation, the bottom line is what matters, and we aren't a corporation. Because hopefully we have enough money to keep the building going. Do we? But we're a family. We're a family of faith. And we come together to be able to be this light on the hill, to be the salt in the earth. We have business that we take care of, much like any household. But the bottom line for us is not how much we are making or how much we are putting in, but how bright we are in this world, how salty we are, if you will. That is what we are about. And then after Jesus lays this all out, I love this part where it says, trying to find it now, oh, do not worry. And it's like, you got to do this. You got to love your enemies. You can't get mad. And it puts all this on us. You got to pray. You got to be humble. You got to just kind of be, and don't worry. But I'm worried because I can't meet all of these expectations. And Jesus again says, look, trust to God. God takes care of the sparrows. God takes care of us. Trust God and just keep trying. So we get a bit of a breather, and then after Jesus kind of gives us a break and says, look, don't worry, I'm with you, trust God, God will be with you, God will provide. And then, oh, by the way, and I think this is the one where the church can probably learn the most. Don't judge. Don't judge others. And I think if there's one place where the church has struggled, it's that we have been seen as a place that judges. We've been seen as a place that discerns whether someone is good or bad, instead of being the place where we provide mercy and grace and love to all. I don't want to be judged. And so the best way for me to do that, according to Scripture, is not to judge others. It is to be someone who sees in people the grace and the love of God. And they might not be making the decisions I want to make. They may be doing things in a very different way. Last Sunday, we had Jason, but then also someone new come in from Dorchester. In case I'm a chaplain also in Dorchester Penitentiary, so I occasionally bring inmates from the prison here. And we brought a new guy came in, and he was really taken by the music last Sunday. And I think one of the hymns we sang was number 10, Here in This Place. Who was song leader? Corrine?
Corrine, yeah.
Anyway, she picked Here in This Place. And we get back into the van and we're driving back, and he's going to me, he goes, that was the most beautiful song I've ever heard. Like that song just blew me away. And I'm like, okay. I've heard it all, okay, yeah. And we get there, and then he comes to me in the chapel after, and he says, can you look up the lyrics? And I said, yeah, I looked up the lyrics, I printed it off. He goes, yep, I'm gonna get it tattooed on my arm. All the lyrics of Here in This Place, he is getting them tattooed on his arm. And there's part of me going like, I thought, these words reached him in a profound way, and this is how he wants to hold on to them. I'm not going to judge. And in fact, I'm just celebrating the fact that it was so meaningful for him, and he's very he's very conscientious about what he does or does not put on his body. More so now than he maybe was in the past, but for him, this is something that is important. This is for him to keep these words on him always. But sometimes when we look at someone for, having grown up, you look and you see tattoos, you go, huh? Or we look at and hairstyle, or how people dress, or what. We find so many ways to look at people and to pass judgment. And that is not who we are called to be. We are called to be people who are struggling to follow the law that God has given us. To be loving, to be compassionate, to turn the other cheek, to go the extra mile, to be the people that are seen as a light. And even as we're struggling with that, we are called not to judge others on their journey. And hope that they don't judge us. I think one of the things that often get people the most is that we judge others because we think they're judging us. We look at people and we think, oh, they're judging me, and I'm going to judge them in return. But when we're not judging someone, we're not even judging them for judging us. That's that whole love and mercy. Someone may look and they say, oh, Gord. And they do all the time. And I'm like, okay. Someone came up to me and was asking for advice on his life when we were talking. And I said, you have time. He was 21. I said, you have time. He goes, yeah. He goes, yeah, I had no idea how old you were. So I got lots of time, I guess. Thank you for that. Thank you. The call that we have been given to be salt in this earth means that we are to be the doers, not just the hearers, as Jesus says. We look for guidance, we seek not to judge, we love those, even those who hate us, and we are humble. We don't walk around as if somehow God has anointed us. Instead, we walk around like God has called us to serve. In compassion and mercy and grace. Now, I will be honest. I think as a congregation, you are amazing. In many ways, you fulfill this passage beautifully, because there aren't people who walk around here with this huge ego. There aren't people who parades the box and put their money in. And you care. You have a thirst for justice, a hunger for righteousness. But we have to keep doing it. We have to continue. I use this congregation all the time. And one of the aspects that in prison people find this thirst or this desire for the presence of God and the community. But then what I hear when they get out is, but we can't find a place that feels like it did in the prison. And it's odd when you think that the group that comes together in the prison, that for them is where they have felt God's presence. And part of that is because they don't feel judged. Because they are accepted with all their faults, with all their mistakes. So we need to be a place, and I'm not saying that we aren't, but we need to continue to work at being the place that doesn't judge, that loves everyone who comes in here, even if they don't love us. That we are humble in our attempts and our ability to fulfill the law of God. How we put these things into practice, it's a struggle, and this is where I go to Paul. Because the thing in the church in Corinth is, even as Jesus is calling all of these things, the church in Corinth, this new church, fresh off the words of Jesus, they're still filled with people who even will have met people who met Jesus. It's that vibrant place, and they've gone off the rails. They are judging one another. They are filled with divisions. They're making big shows about who is spiritual and who is not. They're talking about, I speak in tongues and you don't. I am having this huge banquet. I am gracious, you are not. They exactly lost their way. And looking back 2,000 years, we can pass judgment on them, except they're like us. They're striving to figure out how to follow this almost what seems at times like impossible. And what Paul tells them is, trust the Spirit of God within you. God is speaking to each one of us. There is that voice of God. And we hear all these other voices that call us here, that tell us to do that. But the voice that calls us to love, the voice that calls us to humility, to grace, and to mercy, I would say give special attention to that voice within our hearts. Our spirit, the Spirit of God, will lead us. if we are angry, if we are frustrated, if we are lashing out, if we feel like we have been put upon, if we feel like we have been judged, if we feel like judging, then question that. Because the church at times has done all of these things and felt that they were doing the Word of God when they weren't. And so we have to sit in this hot water of Sermon on the Plain. Because I'm pretty sure it's Luke is this, really? Oh, anyways, Sermon on the Mount. We have to sit in this hot water and realize that it is hard. It might seem simple, but simple is not easy. And that is the aspect of what it means for us to follow. To trust and act in love, even when the world tells us it's crazy. Even when the world tells us it's naive, it's irresponsible, it makes no sense. Still, we trust and we love, we forgive, we embrace. Barbara was starting to wonder about her choice. She had been a minister in churches for decades and decades. And she was just a few years left before retirement, and there was this one congregation that always had issues. They were always in strife. And she had 5 years, and she thought, I'll just spend my last 5 years, and I'll help to bring some peace to this congregation. People really liked Barbara. Barbara was just kind, compassionate, and people just took to her, and she thought, I can take care of this congregation. And she went there, and the first 6 months was fantastic. And then it started. And this time, what started the congregation was one of those things that affects a lot of congregations, and it's music. And specifically, it was a drum kit. One of the young people in the congregation set up a drum kit during a piece in the morning when the youth were leading a service and played the drums. And it all went wild from there. And suddenly you had a huge rift between people in the congregation because the youth that set up the drum kit, then their parents donated the drum kit to the congregation. And so that drum kit was now there to remain. And lo and behold, the drum kit was quickly followed by a bass guitar, which we all know that's just evil, and an electric guitar, and soon you had a rock band on a Sunday morning. And the other people in the congregation, they were longing for the piano and the organ and that sense of peace. And so the church started to divide. And it didn't just divide on music. It divided on what the church was supposed to be. And there were people who were saying, look, the church, we need to attract the young people. We need to pull them in. The rock music is going to do it. That's what's important. And other people were saying, no, the church is a place where we respect our elders, where we are careful of the traditions, and we try to be respectful for all. There are people here who, when that's loud music, it hurts, and they're turning their hearing aids off, and it's causing. We try to be respectful to all the needs. And so both sides were arguing about the music, but really they were arguing about how you are church. And some of them were just arguing because that's what they did. They picked a side and they dug in, and reason and logic would have nothing to do with it. And so they came to Barbara and they said to Barbara, we need 2 services, one for the young and one for the old. And Barbara did not want to do that. It was it was a small congregation, and she knew that as soon as they divided, they would just keep going in separate directions. It was worshiping together. It was being together. It was talking, sharing, praying together that kept them united. And if they didn't do that, how were they to remain a church? And for her, that was very important. She knew other churches had, ministers on videos, and they gathered in 20 different locations and so forth, and fine. But for her, she said, no, we have to stay together. That's what makes us a church. And they said, well, then you have to pick. We're either going to have rock music or we're going to have old music. We're either going to lose the old part of our congregation, we're going to lose the young part of our congregation. Although the truth was, it wasn't really divided along ages. And it was just that that's how people presented it. And perhaps the most difficult part weren't the old and the young, it was the middle group, because they were either staunch defenders of their parents, and this, my parents grew up in this church and this is how they worship and that's good enough. And the others were staunch defenders of their children. I want my children and I want my children's children. And so they were going back and forth and became family issues, and Barbara didn't know what to do. And it just kept getting worse. And they added things, the decor of the church. We needed something modern. We needed something traditional. How we worship. The divide got wider and wider. And Barbara was like, what am I going to do? And her husband was saying, retire early? Like, this is going to be a no-win. And then Barbara did something radical. She thought, if this is about music, and she did not deny that music is important. For a lot of people, that's how they express their faith. It's where they feel close to God. And they would rather have music than sermons, and I understand that. But so Barbara then did something very bizarre. The congregation gathered, and they were going to have a meeting after the service. And so they were all there, everyone came, but they noticed something in the front of the church was something they had never seen there before, perhaps more terrifying than a drum kit. It was a karaoke machine. And Barbara had grown up in the 70s and the 80s when disco had been very popular. And though she did not tell many people, maybe perhaps only her husband knew, she never lost her love of disco. And more than that, perhaps people don't know this, but there were disco Christian rock groups. And she had all of their, well, at that time, records. And she loved Christian disco rock. And so she brought her karaoke machine, and she said, I understand how important it is and how we want to respect each other's expression of our faith and how we connect with God. And I know some feel this is important. I thought I would share with you this morning what is important for me and where I feel the deepest connection with God, and that is in disco, Christian disco. And she turned on the karaoke machine, she grabbed the mic, and she sang a very Bee Gees-like kind of song. When she finished, there was silence. No one, they didn't move, they just were like frozen. Except her husband, who was trying so hard not to laugh. But finally he kind of, and then the whole congregation roared in laughter. Everyone. And they took like 5 minutes for everyone to stop laughing. And when everyone stopped laughing, she said, this is who we are. In the pain of listening to me sing disco, to the joy of us just laughing together, this is who we are. We have disagreements, we have issues, but the most important thing to remember is that we are together. And the congregation came up with a plan, and it was rotating. One Sunday they had like 3 hymns like we do. One Sunday, the 3 hymns would be more youth-oriented. The others would be more traditional. And Barbara made it very clear that if you only came on the Sundays when your music was playing, you weren't fulfilling the covenant that they all made. And they did. They came faithfully regardless of who was playing. But every time there was any sort of issue or difficulty in the congregation, all Barbara had to say is, I still have the karaoke machine. And they would find a way to resolve it. To be people of God. I read through 5, 6, and 7, and I am overcome with how I have failed to love my enemies, how I have responded in anger, how I have done all of these things that I should not have done, how I have judged when I should not have judged. And then I go back to the don't worry, but mostly what I look at as I look at the grace and the mercy of Christ, of Jesus. Because right after that, Jesus starts healing people. And his mercy and his grace to the outsiders, to the people who are forgotten, to the people who would be dismissed. We come from a long line of people on the road with us since the church in Corinth, trying to put this all together, to be this light on the hill, to be the salt in the earth. And we continue that struggle, sometimes more successful than others. But I invite you to spend some time in conflict of the Sermon on the Mount and to ask yourself, am I responding in anger? Am I loving those who hate me? Am I judging those who are different? Am I more concerned with how I look than what I am doing? These are questions we need to ask ourselves over and over again, because the road we are on still continues before us, and the world, every bit as much as it did in the time of the church in Corinth, needs a light, needs salt, needs to have a place where they can feel the love and the grace and the mercy of Christ.